Hello, everyone. My name is Yvette Cozier. I'm the Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice at Boston University School of Public Health. Thank you for joining us for our latest public health conversation starter. Today's conversation is part of our SPH Reads series. SPH Reads is a school-wide reading program hosted by the Office of Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Justice. It aims to encourage critical thought and discussion among all members of the SPH community and is centered on a carefully chosen, thought-provoking book. The selection for fall 2024, spring 2025 academic year is Strangers in Their Own Land, Anger and Mourning on the American Right by Dr. Arlie Russell Hochschild. In conjunction with this year's book selection, I'm having discussions with leaders on themes of political divides, class, and race. Today, I have the privilege of speaking with Dr. Matthew Motta, who is an assistant professor of health law, policy, and management at Boston University School of Public Health. He was previously an assistant professor of political science, focusing on American politics and research methods at Oklahoma State University. Dr. Motta received his PhD in political science from the University of Minnesota. His research investigates the social and political determinants of anti-science attitudes and assesses the health policy consequences. Dr. Motta's first book, Anti-Scientific Americans, The Prevalence, Origins, and Political Consequences of Anti-Intellectualism in the U.S., was recently published by Oxford University Press. The book offers new theoretical and data-driven insights into the prevalence, origins, and policy consequences of anti-intellectualism and considers how to restore America's faith in experts. Thank you for being with us today, Matt.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. So can you start by sharing the themes that stood out to you most while you were reading Strangers in Their Own Land?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really important themes that stand out from this book, but one really stands out above all of them. And that's this question of why it is that some of the people in some of the poorest and most polluted parts of this country end up voting for politicians, supporting political causes that ultimately aim to undermine their interests in those areas, voting and supporting politicians who could make them better off financially, who could do something to clean up the areas where they live and work. In other words, why would people cast their ballots in such a way that we might see as not advancing their social and economic welfare? And I think the book gives us a preliminary and important answer to this question, which is that people have been made to feel like they might lose something if they were to vote any other way, that if they were to support those folks who might take more action to improve their socioeconomic standing, to do something to clean up the environment, that they would lose something along the way. And I imagine that that will be a major theme of our discussion today. But before we drill into these specifics there, I want to take a step back and make a broader point, which is that I think it's tempting to see people who vote against their social and economic and environmental interests and cast them off as being stupid or ignorant. They don't know what they're doing. Otherwise, why would they vote this way? And I think what this book challenges us to do is to think about the myriad social, religious, political, and other factors that can get in the way that also motivate the way we vote and the way we think politically in ways that we might value just as much as all of those other considerations that are laid out in the book. So I think the book challenges us to both recognize the very real problem here, but to also approach it with some humility and understanding. And that's what stands out to me from the book.
Now that you bring up a really good point. I often, in talking with friends, colleagues, say that, yeah, I think they think the same about us, right? they don't quite understand where our side comes from. So
Right.
yes, we do need to approach that with great humility, certainly. So as I mentioned earlier, your book, Anti-Scientific Americans, was recently released. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Can you explain a bit more about what anti-intellectualism is and share some of the common themes between your book and Strangers in Their Own Land?
Yeah, well, thanks so much. And I'm happy to do that. My book kind of picks up where some of the classic theorizing about anti-intellectualism in the United States leaves off. I'm drawing in particular on work from sociologist and historian Richard Hofstadter, who gave us lots of examples of the ways that Americans tend to express negative attitudes towards scientists and experts and academics, the devaluation of rational thought. And what I try to do in the book is to quantify and test some of the assertions that have been made in Hofstadter's and others' works over the years. Anti-intellectualism, as I conceptualize it in the book, pertains to something very specific. It pertains to the negative attitudes that people have towards scientists and academics and other credentialed experts. We can contrast those negative and very personal feelings that people have about their distrust of scientists and other experts from other ways that we might think about anti-intellectualism, such as the devaluation of rational thought, people who don't believe in science or the scientific method. That's not what I'm talking about in the book. I'm talking about the very personalized attacks on not just science, but scientists that we see in this modern age, that we see quite frequently on the campaign trail in 2024 and previously. I talk about and think about very often, for example, the remarks of Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida, who claimed that he wanted to punt Anthony Fauci into the Potomac River, calling him, I believe, a little elf along the way, right? These are these highly personalized attacks on the people who produce scientific research. And I think that there is an important link between, my book and the book that we're talking about today, which is that folks in Louisiana, folks who are being interviewed as part of this book, they're not necessarily anti-science. They're not necessarily people who devalue rational thought, but they're people who harbor suspicions about the motives of those who produce scientific research. I think that's another theme that comes up throughout the book. Not necessarily that people don't believe climate science, but that they don't believe the people who are producing it. And I think that is very much an orchestrated political effort on behalf of certain political actors to sow distrust in the political or the perceived political motivations of those scientists and experts. And so I think that's the link there, that folks are expressing a form of anti-intellectual sentiment that doesn't imply that they're stupid, that doesn't imply that they don't know things about science, but instead implies that they are motivated to hold negative attitudes toward a particular group of people. And I think that one of the things that my book can help explain is why it is that folks in Louisiana and elsewhere hold negative views toward climate science. Because one of the things that I demonstrate throughout the book is that if you're the type of person who holds negative views towards scientists and experts and academics, you're also the kind of person who disbelieves the things that they have to say. You're more likely to accept misinformation about vaccine safety and efficacy. You're more likely to believe things that aren't true about the performance of the economy. And I think of most relevance to this book, you are very likely to deny that climate change is caused by human activities and oppose policies that could make us better off. So I think that's a common link between between the two books as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And I'm just thinking back to the book in the case where there were characters or, those who were interviewed who actually had an active role in, polluting and so understood that this was a man-created,
Right.
situation,
Right.
but still found themselves, I think one character was really trying to get the Tea Party to come to embrace the environment, but
Yeah.
at the same time, it's like they've done this damage, and they're like, okay, oh well,
Yeah. Well, and if I can jump in just really
Yeah.
quickly for a second, one of the things that a lot of social scientists in this space have alleged for years is that science has become very politically polarizing in recent years. And we argue over when that polarization began. There are some people who place it during the Reagan administration, others who place it during Newt Gingrich's rise and the Contract with America in the mid-1990s, others pin it on George Bush. I show in the book that it's really the Tea Party that accelerates this. The Tea Party, very much born out of a reaction to the Obama presidency, and in particular, as we've shown in some of our past research, Obama's race. This was an attack on Barack Obama as a person, and one of the ways that the Tea Party could speak without necessarily mentioning the color of his skin was to talk about his intellectualism, to cast doubts on his intellectual bona fides, to basically devalue the types of people who produce the research and work at the institutions where Obama went as part of an effort to talk about his race in that coded language. And that ultimately, I think, is what leads to the sharpest politicization of science, such that Republicans have come to hold more negative views and Democrats have come to hold more positive views. So that's another link, I think, between the two.
Yeah, really good point. Can you discuss a little bit about what prospect theory is and its effects on public health?
Absolutely. So, as I mentioned at the top of this discussion, I think that folks in Louisiana and elsewhere have been made to feel as if they might lose something if they were to support those political candidates and causes that might make them better off socially, economically, environmentally, and the like. And I think a lot of this has to do with the psychology of how it is that people make decisions, not just people in the book. All of us think this way. Prospect theory is this idea that we tend to value losses more than equally sized gains. If I had two groups of people in the American public that looked more or less like one another, and I asked one group how they felt about a policy that would produce 90% employment, and then asked another group about a policy that would produce 10% unemployment, everybody watching this call right now can say that those two policies are the same thing. 90% employment is necessarily 10% unemployment. But what we find in public opinion research from the great Nobel Prize winning work of folks like Danny Kahneman, Amos Tversky, and others is that people don't think about them the same way. They tend to think about the policy that produces 10% unemployment in more negative terms than they otherwise would the policy that produces 90% employment. We are scared of losses. This is a natural human phenomenon. And this is what prospect theory tells us to expect. And so if you're going to tell people in a place like those places that were surveyed in the book, that they are potentially going to lose money out of their monthly income, hard-earned money, through taxation, in order to support the policies that could make them better off environmentally or economically, well, that's a very real cost. And people value costs very much. And so it has to be very tangible and large, the benefits of taking action to the contrary. And something like combating the threats of climate change, something like cleaning up polluted parts of the country, those benefits may be less tangible to us than the very real costs of losing money out of your monthly paycheck. And so I think that prospect theory can help us make sense, in part, of what's going on in the book. And again, this is a phenomenon that literally all of us experience from time to time. And so it helps, I think, humanize and helps us understand the position that folks in the book are experiencing.
Thank you for that. That's very enlightening. And so the natural impetus then is to so how do we educate those who are like anti-scientific, anti-intellectual, and what is an effective way, and certainly as public health practitioners, how can we educate them on the health outcomes in regards to these policies and the politics that they find themselves in the middle of, and all of us in the middle of.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a big believer in meeting people where they are. I think our research shows that this is an effective strategy for health communication. And here's what I mean by that. People hold opinions at odds with science for many different reasons. And what that means is that there's no one strategy that's going to work for everybody. I think we need to make an effort to understand why some people oppose science and make an effort to communicate the reasons why they ought to support the science, the reasons why they ought to support evidence-based medicine and the like. And I can give you an example from our research that I think is also relevant to the book that we're discussing today, which is that we tend to find that folks who hold negative sentiments toward vaccination, for example, tend to be more likely to consider themselves to be Republicans. They tend to hold more conservative political orientations. And look, those views are very much tied into people's perceptions of the scientific community and the research they produce. But it's going to be a heck of a lot harder for me to fundamentally change the way that people think about science and scientists than it is for me to say, look, here's examples of prominent Republicans who have chosen to receive the COVID-19 vaccine, who get their flu shot every year. Try to understand where people are coming from. Try to think about who it is that they find to be credible communicators of these issues, perhaps in place of folks like those of us who are watching this webinar, and make an appeal to them in that regard. Now, I will say that I do think that one strategy that holds promise for improving faith in the scientific community more generally, although I still don't think it's a one-size-fits-all solution, would be to stimulate people's interest in science. The research from myself and others that we've done over the years has shown that if you can make people, especially young people, interested in science at young ages, that fosters a lifetime of trust in not just science and the scientific method, but the people who carry it out every day, like many of the people watching this call. And so efforts to try to stimulate people's interest in science. I'm thinking, for example, about the fact that Mayor Wu has now made it possible for Boston public school students every, I believe, second Sunday of the month to visit many different museums throughout our, great city. That this is the type of thing that could stimulate people's science interest at young ages and ultimately make them more trusting of science. We need to think creatively in that regard, and we need to not shoot for solutions that are going to be a one-size-fits-all, tied up with a bow type of communication strategy, because that's just not the way the world works.
Yeah, yeah. And so, we now have a new class of students who have joined us at the beginning of this month, who are very, animated and very excited and just sure how they're going to do public health. In addition to what you just said, what advice would you give them as they get introduced to a world full of skeptics?
That's right. I've been thinking about this a lot lately, especially with the rise of artificial intelligence and the role it is playing in creating fictionalized content in the 2024 election. As you mentioned, I'm a political scientist. I'm somebody who thinks about misinformation, not just from a health point of view, but also from a political point of view. And here's the advice I would give. As you traverse your political worlds, your public health worlds, you are going to encounter lots of information and potentially misinformation that does a very good job of disguising itself as information. One of the things that I like to talk about, and I have a couple of pieces that are hopefully forthcoming on this soon, is that often science skeptics and health skeptics use the language of science in order to take it down. They talk about that one peer-reviewed study that shows that actually vaccines may not be so safe. They talk about that one peer-reviewed study that shows that climate change is not caused by people. And they don't think about the broader, or they purposely ignore the broader context of what's being produced through the scientific literature. And so my advice is that folks watching this call make an effort to be informed consumers of what it is that they encounter online. And there's a couple of different ways you can do that. I have conversations with folks in my class who ask me if pieces of information or misinformation are true or not. And I say, well, you know what? You're showing me a screen grab of something on Twitter. If this was a real tweet that somebody actually put out, why not show me the tweet? Why does it have to be a screen grab that could potentially be altered? And if you were to then do some digging and dig into the headline, could you find a news story from a reputable outlet that actually mentioned this thing? If you're talking about information that's presented in the form of screen grabs or videos where there are no links to external sources, and when you look for external sources, you can't find them, or they seem dubious in some way, that piece of information is most likely not true. And look, that's a lot of work to do. And I'm not saying that every single time you encounter a tweet or a viral TikTok, you ought to do this. But before you share information, before you cite it in a paper in my class or another class or something like that, before you mention it to friends and family, do that work to figure out what's true and what's false. And I think if you're able to do that and you're willing to do that from time to time, we're all going to be better off for it.
So as you say, that is a lot of work, but it is worthwhile and
So
incredible. So Matt, I want to thank you so much for your insights and spending this time with us today. We look forward to reading your new book and having future conversations with you. So
Thanks so much for having me.
very welcome.
Thanks.